Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Today I'm going to tell you 8 scary stories about abandoned cabins in the Appalachian Mountains. These stories are real, and they happened to real people. The cabins I'm talking about have been empty for years, but something still lives there. Something that doesn't want visitors. Before we start, please hit that subscribe button if you like scary stories. And don't forget to like this video and tell your friends about it. I also want to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Thanks for watching my channel. You guys are awesome. Okay, let's get into these creepy cabin stories. I'm 24, and honestly, my anxiety was so bad that I couldn't even order pizza over the phone without having a panic attack. My therapist, Dr. Chen, had been working with me for about 6 months when she suggested something that sounded absolutely insane: extreme exposure therapy. The idea was to face my biggest fear head-on in a controlled environment. My biggest fear wasn't spiders or heights or anything normal like that. It was being completely alone, isolated from everyone and everything. So she recommended I rent a cabin somewhere remote and spend 2 weeks by myself. I found this place called Terror Mountain in Virginia, which looking back should have been my first red flag. But the cabin was cheap, and it was about as isolated as you could get. 3 hours from the nearest town, up a winding dirt road that made my rental car's GPS lose signal about halfway up. I'd never driven mountain roads before, but I was determined to push through my limitations. This was supposed to be the start of getting my life back. The cabin itself wasn't too bad when I first arrived. Small, basic, but clean enough. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. The previous renters had left some firewood stacked outside, which I appreciated since it was early October, and the nights were getting cold. I spent the first few days just getting used to the silence. In the city, there's always noise, traffic, neighbors, something. Up here, it was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. I brought my therapy journal with me, and every morning I'd write down my anxiety levels on a scale of 1 to 10. Day 1 was about an 8. Day 3, down to a 6. By the end of the first week, I was actually sleeping through the night and cooking real meals for myself instead of just eating granola bars. I felt proud of myself for the first time in months. I was even starting to plan what fear I'd tackle next, maybe public speaking or job interviews. That's when things started getting weird. It was the beginning of my second week when I woke up to find what looked like elaborate therapy exercises set up around the cabin. There were fake spider webs stretched between the trees right outside my bedroom window, complete with these incredibly realistic plastic spiders. At first I thought maybe the cabin owner had set up some kind of Halloween decoration and forgotten to mention it. But when I went to check them out, they triggered my anxiety in this weird artificial way, like being in a haunted house where you know it's fake, but your body reacts anyway. That night I started hearing sounds from the forest. Not normal forest sounds. I'd gotten used to those. These were recorded sounds, I was pretty sure. Breaking glass, footsteps that were too heavy and too regular, whispers that seemed to come from speakers hidden in the trees. I checked my anxiety monitoring app on my phone, one of those programs that tracks your heart rate and breathing patterns. The readings it was showing were impossible, fear levels way beyond what any human should be able to experience and still function. The therapy equipment I'd brought with me started changing too. My breathing exercise timer would suddenly switch to horror movie soundtracks. The meditation apps on my phone would open by themselves and play recordings of screaming. I found my anxiety medication bottles one morning, except they weren't filled with pills anymore. There was this dark liquid inside that seemed to pulse with its own light, and just being near them made my chest tight with panic. By the third night of the second week, my cabin walls were covered with paintings that definitely hadn't been there before. Not just any paintings, these were images of my specific phobias, being trapped in the elevators, surrounded by crowds of strangers, having panic attacks in public places. And they moved. I'd look at one showing me hyperventilating in a grocery store, and the painted version of me would turn its head and make eye contact. The temperature would drop whenever my anxiety spiked, which was happening more and more often. My fear responses were amplifying beyond anything I'd ever experienced. Panic attacks that used to last 20 minutes were going on for hours. Every coping mechanism Dr. Chen had taught me was not only failing, it was making things worse. Deep breathing exercises made me feel like I was suffocating. Progressive muscle relaxation made my whole body seize up with terror. Then I started hearing my own voice screaming in the forest. Multiple recordings of my panic attacks would play simultaneously from different directions, creating this symphony of terror that echoed off the mountains. But mixed in with my screaming, I could hear Dr. Chen's voice listing every possible disaster that could happen to me. Car accidents, house fires, losing my job, everyone I cared about abandoning me, all spoken in her exact tone and cadence, like she was reading from my therapy notes. That's when I saw them. Tall figures made of shadow and smoke, moving between the trees in my peripheral vision. At first, I thought I was hallucinating from stress, but they were too consistent, too purposeful. They seemed to feed on my fear, growing more solid and defined as my terror increased. The more scared I got, the clearer they became, until I could see that they were definitely not human. They were creating the fear scenarios, setting up elaborate horror shows designed specifically to harvest my anxiety. More appeared each night, all working together to maximize my panic. They communicated through shared phobias, showing me visions of every possible thing I could be afraid of. They used voice mimicry too, calling to me in the voices of my parents, my sister, Dr. Chen, telling me about all the ways I was going to fail and suffer. I realized they were ancient teachers, Hings that had been doing this for centuries, cultivating human terror like farmers growing crops. The cabin had probably housed dozens of people like me over the years, anxiety sufferers looking for help who instead became permanent fear generators. I could see them sometimes in the forest, other people trapped in a constant state of panic, their terror feeding these shadow creatures forever. The entities tried to make deals with me. They showed me visions of safety and peace, offering to take away all my fears if I just agreed to stay and become another fear producer for them. But I understood what that meant. Living in constant, manufactured terror to power their feeding off other people's anxiety. That's when something Dr. Chen had taught me finally clicked. She'd always emphasized the difference between natural fear that keeps you safe and artificial fear that paralyzes you. This was artificial, manufactured. These things were creating phobias that didn't exist naturally, amplifying normal anxiety into supernatural terror. I used the real therapy techniques she'd taught me, not the corrupted versions the entities were showing me. I focused on my breathing, not to make the fear go away, but to recognize it as external, artificial, something being done to me rather than something coming from me. I grounded myself in reality by naming 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, 1 thing I could taste. The shadow figures became more agitated as I fought back. They ramped up their fear scenarios, but I kept using my actual coping strategies. The visions of safety they showed me started looking obviously fake, like movie sets with painted backdrops. Their voice mimicry got sloppy. They'd use the right words but the wrong emotional tone, or they'd reference things the real people in my life would never say. I managed to get to my car during what felt like the eye of a hurricane of manufactured terror. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the keys in the ignition, but I drove down that mountain road while having the worst panic attack of my life. But even in the middle of it, I was managing my breathing properly, using real techniques instead of the corrupted versions the entities had been feeding me. As soon as I got cell service again, I called Dr. Chen. When I told her what had happened, she didn't dismiss it as hallucinations brought on by stress. She said she'd had other patients report similar experiences in remote locations, always anxiety sufferers seeking isolation therapy. We worked together to process what I'd experienced, and I realized I'd actually learned something valuable: how to tell the difference between real fear and manufactured fear. I became an anxiety counselor myself a few years later, specializing in helping people recognize when their fears are being artificially amplified. I teach exposure therapy, but only in safe, controlled environments. I never recommend isolation therapy anymore, and I always warn my patients about places that seem designed to prey on people seeking to overcome their fears. I still live with anxiety, but it's manageable now. I can handle appropriate challenges without avoiding them, but I've also learned to recognize when fear is being artificially created or manipulated. Sometimes in crowded places, I'll feel that same artificial terror I experienced on Terror Mountain. That sensation of fear being fed to me from an external source rather than generated by my own mind. When that happens, I know there are more of those entities out there, probably in cities where they can feed off the anxiety of thousands of people at once. I never went back to Terror Mountain, and I tell all my patients to avoid any therapeutic retreat that promises to cure their fears through extreme isolation. Real healing happens with support, not in places where things are waiting to feed off your terror. I was 24 when I finally got the courage to leave Jake. I know that sounds dramatic, but honestly, it took me putting myself in the hospital before I realized I couldn't keep living like that. I was a nursing student at the time, about 6 months from graduating, and I guess seeing all those patients come through the ER with injuries like mine finally woke me up. My Aunt Rosa, she's my mom's sister, heard what happened and offered me her family's old cabin up in Lost Creek Hollow, West Virginia. Hide there as long as you need, she told me. Nobody knows about that place except family. So I packed everything I owned into my beat-up Corolla and drove up into the mountains. The cabin sat way back in the hollow, maybe 3 miles off the main road down this dirt track that barely deserved to be called a driveway. No neighbors for miles, no cell towers, nothing but trees and quiet. It was perfect for what I needed. Somewhere Jake would never think to look. Somewhere I could heal up and figure out what came next. The place had been in our family for about 80 years, Rosa told me. Her grandfather built it during the Depression, and different relatives had used it over the decades for hunting trips or just getting away from things. It was rustic but solid. One big room with a stone fireplace, a little kitchen, and a loft area where the bed was. The whole place felt like stepping back in time, which honestly was exactly what I needed. The first week, I basically slept 12 hours a day. My body was still healing from the last time Jake lost his temper, and my mind was just exhausted from months of walking on eggshells. I'd wake up around noon, make some simple food, read these old romance novels Rosa had left there, and just try to remember who I was before Jake. The doors had good solid locks, and for the first time in years, I actually felt safe when I went to sleep. At night. I started writing in this journal I'd brought, mostly about my plans for after I graduated nursing school. I was thinking maybe I'd specialize in trauma care, help people who'd been through what I had. Looking back now, I think that was my mind trying to make sense of everything, trying to find some purpose in all the pain. It was during the second week that I noticed the dolls. I was sitting on the front porch one morning, drinking coffee, and watching the mist come up off the creek, when I saw them hanging from the trees. At first I thought maybe they were just some kind of bird or something moving in the breeze, but when I got closer, I realized they were these tiny cloth dolls. Not red cloth like you might think. Each one was sewn to look like a different person. There was a man doll, a woman doll, several that looked like children, even one that looked elderly. They all had these unique little faces stitched on and button eyes that seemed to watch the cabin. They hung from fishing line, spinning slowly in the mountain breeze. I counted maybe 15 or 20 of them scattered through the trees around the cabin. I figured maybe some previous family member had made them, or maybe local kids had put them up as some kind of prank. Mountain people do all sorts of folk art stuff, right? But that night, the forest didn't go quiet like it usually did. Instead, it filled up with these whispered conversations. I could hear fragments of different voices. Sometimes it sounded like people arguing, sometimes like family dinners, sometimes like lovers talking. It was all soft and overlapping, like having a radio tuned between stations where you can almost make out words, but not quite. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind in the trees, or maybe sound carrying from somewhere else in the hollow. But honestly, it sounded too much like actual conversations. I see keys. Would pick out distinct voices. An older woman, a young man, children laughing, even what sounded like a baby crying. The third morning, my phone started acting weird. I mean, I didn't have any service up there anyway, but the apps were still working fine for games and music and stuff. Except now, when I opened my photos, there were pictures I'd never taken. Not scary pictures or anything, just normal family photos, but of people I didn't recognize. There were birthday parties, graduation photos, wedding pictures, all mixed in with my own pictures like they'd always been there. The text messages were worse. I'd open my messaging app and see whole conversations I'd never had, with numbers I didn't recognize. They looked like normal family chatter. Don't forget to pick up milk. Can't wait to see you this weekend. Love you too, honey. But I'd never sent or received any of them. I started finding these wooden boxes buried around the cabin. Not deep, just a few inches under the fallen leaves. Each box was about the size of a shoebox, carved from some kind of dark wood and filled with personal items. Wedding rings, baby shoes, old love letters, photographs, all organized by what emotion they represented. One box had only sad things: funeral programs, divorce papers, hospital bracelets. Another had happy items: birthday cards, prom corsages, ultrasound pictures. The weird thing was, some of the items looked really old, like from decades ago, but others looked recent. There was even a smartphone in one of the boxes, which didn't make sense if these had been buried for years. I started finding little wooden totems on the windowsills too. They were carved to look like tiny people, each one holding a miniature object from the boxes. A little wooden woman holding a tiny wedding ring, a carved man with a small graduation cap. They felt warm to the touch, like they were alive somehow, and sometimes I swear I could feel them breathing. One night I noticed these spiral patterns carved into the cabin floor that I'd never seen before. They were filled with what looked like crystallized tears, these clear, hard drops that caught the light. The patterns glowed faintly after dark, creating this soft light that made me feel drowsy and confused. I'd find myself staring at them for what felt like minutes, but when I looked at the clock, hours had passed. That's when I realized my own memories were getting fuzzy. I couldn't remember Jake's face clearly anymore, which should have been impossible since he'd been in my life for 3 years. The trauma from our relationship was fading too, in a way that felt unnatural. I mean, I was grateful the nightmares had stopped, but it was happening too fast, too completely. I started finding my own things mixed in with the cabin items. My childhood bracelet that I'd lost years ago was sitting on the kitchen table one morning. My high school yearbook, which I definitely hadn't brought with me, was on the bookshelf. It was like pieces of my past were being pulled from somewhere and arranged around the cabin. The whispered voices started, including my own voice too. I'd hear myself talking about nursing school, about my dreams for the future, about memories from childhood. But I'd be sitting right there not talking, hearing my own voice coming from the woods telling stories I remembered but had never told anyone. Around midnight on my 10th night there, I saw them. They were small, maybe the size of children, but they moved through the cabin like they owned the place. They had these oversized heads and delicate hands, and they moved so carefully, like librarians handling rare books. I watched from the loft as they sorted through things I couldn't see, organizing and cataloging with this intense focus. More appeared each night. They'd communicate through these waves of emotion that I could actually feel: happiness, sadness, love, fear, all washing over me in ways that had nothing to do with my own feelings. They worked together on what seemed like some vast filing system, taking invisible items from one place and carefully putting them somewhere else. I realized they were collecting memories, human experiences. The voices I'd been hearing were actual conversations they'd recorded, playing them back like some kind of archive. They'd been doing this for a long time, centuries maybe, drawn to places where people felt strong emotions. The memory eaters, I started calling them in my head. They were gentle about it, careful, like surgeons removing something damaged. They were taking away my pain, my trauma, all the hurt Jake had caused me. In exchange, they were preserving my good memories, my dreams, my hopes for the future. But they wanted more than just the bad memories. They wanted it all. One night, they showed me other people living in the trees around the hollow. Men and women of different ages, all smiling these blank, peaceful smiles. They looked happy, but empty. Content, but hollow. The memory eaters had taken everything, the good with the bad, and left them with just basic function. No real joy, no real sadness, no real anything. They communicated with me telepathically that night, showing me beautiful visions of what life could be like without pain. No more nightmares about Jake. No more jumping at unexpected sounds. No more flinching when someone raised their voice. Just peace. Perfect, empty peace. I understood then that my healing had been happening too fast because they were editing my experiences, taking away the parts that hurt, but also taking away the parts that had made me strong enough to finally leave Jake in the first place. They showed me Jake's memories too somehow, his childhood, his own abuse, his pain. I felt compassion for him, but I also knew that accepting their gift meant losing myself completely. My trauma was part of who I was. It had taught me empathy, made me want to help other people, given me the strength to recognize when I deserved better. When I tried to leave the next morning, my car wouldn't move. The engine started fine, but the wheels just spun like I was stuck in invisible mud. I could feel them pleading with me telepathically, showing me more visions of painless existence, of perfect emotional numbness. But I chose to keep my trauma. I chose to keep the pain, because I knew it had made me who I was. It had given me compassion, strength, and purpose. Without it, I wouldn't be Sam anymore. The moment I made that decision, really made it in my heart, the car lurched forward like whatever had been holding it decided to let go. I drove out of that hollow, seeing the memory eaters in my rearview mirror, waving sadly, holding tiny dolls that looked just like me. I went back to nursing school and graduated 6 months later. I specialized in trauma counseling, and I've spent the last 8 years helping other abuse survivors. I use my experience with Jake to help them understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting, that pain can be transformed into purpose without being erased. I never tried to forget what happened with Jake. Instead, I learned to carry it without shame, to use it as a tool for helping others rather than a weight that held me back. Sometimes I still find small wooden totems in my apartment, on my windowsill, on my kitchen counter, by my bedside. I know the memory eaters are still watching over me, still hoping I'll change my mind. But honestly, to this day, I'm grateful for my scars. They remind me how far I've come, and they help me reach other people who are still trapped in their own Lost Creek hollows, whether they're made of mountains or just made of fear. I was 24 when I lost my job at Romano's downtown because of my cocaine problem. Honestly, looking back now, I'm lucky that's all I lost. My sponsor, Jerry, kept telling me I needed to get away from the city for a while, somewhere I couldn't just walk to a corner and find what I was looking for. My uncle had this cabin up in Hollow Moon Valley, West Virginia, and he said I could use it for as long as I needed. So I packed everything I owned into my beat-up Honda and drove up there, thinking maybe 30 days in the mountains would help me figure out how to rebuild my life. The cabin was perfect for what I needed. It had this amazing kitchen with a wood-burning stove and all the space I could want. I'd been a cook before the drugs took over everything, and I figured maybe getting back to basics in the kitchen would help me stay clean. The first week went exactly like I hoped it would. I'd drive down to the little store in town every few days, buy simple ingredients, and spend hours just cooking. Nothing fancy, just basic stuff like stew and fresh bread. I forgot how much I loved the rhythm of chopping vegetables and kneading dough. For the first time in years, I was sleeping through the night without my mind racing about where I was going to get my next fix. I started keeping a recovery journal like Jerry suggested, writing down what I cooked each day and how it made me feel. I even started planning this idea about opening a simple restaurant someday, maybe one that could help other people in recovery by giving them jobs and teaching them cooking skills. The mountains were so quiet up there, especially at night. No traffic, no sirens, just the sound of wind through the trees. I felt like I was finally getting my head clear. But then, weird things started happening in the second week. I woke up one morning and found these elaborate sculptures made out of fruits and vegetables, sitting right outside the cabin. I'm talking about towers of apples and carrots balanced in ways that shouldn't have been possible, like they were defying gravity or something. They smelled incredible but wrong somehow. The scent was too intense, like someone had concentrated the flavor of every piece of fruit into pure essence. I walked around them, trying to figure out how they were staying up without any support, but I couldn't see any wires or anything holding them together. The next morning, there were more of them, different arrangements, but still impossible. And that's when I started hearing these sizzling sounds coming from the forest, like there was this massive invisible kitchen out there cooking meals around the clock. At first I thought maybe it was just the wind or some kind of insect I wasn't familiar with, but it definitely sounded like oil in a hot pan. Things got stranger when I was cooking inside the cabin. I'd be dicing onions, and I swear they'd start looking more like pearls than vegetables. Carrots would take on this golden color that wasn't natural. The oven seemed to know exactly what temperature I needed without me adjusting it. I'd set it to 350, but when I checked, it would be at the perfect heat for whatever I was making, even if that wasn't 350. Then I found these serving platters that definitely weren't there when I arrived. They looked like they were made from crystallized honey and hardened wine, all ornate and beautiful. The crazy thing was, they never emptied. I'd put a simple pasta dish on one and it would somehow become this gourmet version with ingredients I hadn't even used. The flavors were incredible, but they made me dizzy, like they were too intense for my brain to process. Outside, there were these massive wooden spoons hanging from the trees like wind chimes. They'd move in the breeze, stirring empty air, and they made this rhythmic sound that matched my heartbeat exactly. It was hypnotic, like listening to cooking music that was designed just for me. The temperature in the kitchen stayed perfect, no matter what the weather was doing outside, which was convenient, but definitely not normal. My appetite started changing around this time. I was getting hungry in a way I'd never experienced before, deeper than anything I felt even during the worst of my withdrawal. It reminded me of how desperate I used to get for cocaine, but this was all focused on food and cooking. Everything I ate tasted more intense each day. Flavors became so strong they'd make me lightheaded. That's when I started hearing the dinner bells. They'd ring from somewhere deep in the forest, these rich metallic tones that made my mouth water instantly. Multiple bells would ring at different pitches, creating these complex melodies that sounded like they were announcing the most incredible meals you could imagine. And then I started hearing voices calling my name. "Diego, come cook with us." The voices sounded like famous chefs I'd always admired, offering to teach me recipes that would make me world famous. I knew I should have been scared, but honestly, I was more curious than anything. The craving for whatever was happening out there was getting stronger every day. One night around midnight, I looked out the kitchen window and saw them. Tall figures in pristine white chef coats were moving between the trees, carrying ingredients that shouldn't exist. They had multiple arms like those Hindu gods you see in pictures, all stirring and chopping at the same time. They worked constantly, preparing elaborate feasts for guests I couldn't see. More of them appeared each night, all focused on creating these perfect culinary experiences. The strangest part was how they communicated. They'd somehow share tastes with me directly. I'd suddenly know the flavor of dishes I'd never tried, ingredients from places I'd never been. It was like they were downloading their knowledge straight into my brain through my tasks. To buds, they started showing me things in my dreams. This ultimate restaurant where every dish was perfect, where every customer left completely satisfied. They offered me mastery of all cooking, the ability to create foods that could cure any addiction. They promised I'd never want drugs again if I joined them, because I'd have something so much better to crave. But that's when I realized what was really happening. This was just another addiction. I was trading my cocaine dependence for an obsession with food and cooking. The pattern was exactly the same. The promise that just one more taste, just one more meal, just one more perfect dish would finally satisfy me. But I could see other people trapped in forest kitchens, cooking frantically, unable to stop. Their hunger could never be satisfied. They always needed to cook more, taste more, create more. I recognized it from rehab. Every addiction feels necessary when you're in it. Every addiction promises to be the solution to all your problems. I used everything Jerry had taught me about recognizing triggers and breaking patterns. Instead of giving in to the craving, I forced myself to destroy the elaborate kitchen setup. I threw all those magical ingredients into the creek behind the cabin. The hunger shapers, that's what I started calling them, screamed in rage, but they couldn't force me to cook. Addiction only works if you participate willingly. I drove away while my stomach was cramping with withdrawal, but I recognized the feeling from rehab. It was the same sensation, just focused on food instead of cocaine. The hunger shapers followed me partway down the mountain, but they couldn't leave their territory. When I got back to the city, I opened a simple soup kitchen. Nothing fancy, just basic nutrition for homeless people who needed a meal. I never cook elaborate dishes anymore. I focus on simple, healthy food that helps people instead of enslaving them. Sometimes I still smell those impossible flavors in my dreams. I know the hunger shapers are still up there in Hollow Moon Valley waiting for the next person who's trying to replace one addiction with another. To be fair, I think they've been doing this for a very long time, perfecting the art of turning people's desires against them. I still don't cook anything more complicated than soup and sandwiches. Looking back now, I realize that's probably saved my life twice. I was 23 when I lost my job at the insurance office because my supervisor said my appearance made customers uncomfortable. Honestly, I can't really blame them. The burns from the house fire 6 months earlier had left me looking like something out of a nightmare. My face, arms, and hands were covered in thick, ropey scars that turned red and angry whenever I got emotional, which was basically all the time back then. I couldn't handle the stares anymore, the way people would look at me and then quickly look away like they'd seen something they shouldn't have. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I found the most isolated cabin I could rent in the mountains of North Carolina and disappeared for the summer. The place was perfect for hiding. Trader's Gap was this tiny little community tucked back in the hills where the old logging roads barely counted as roads anymore. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt track about 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by thick pine and oak trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, even at noon. The rental company probably thought I was crazy paying cash for 3 months up front, but honestly, it was worth every penny to not have to deal with people looking at me like I was some kind of freak show. I drove up there with my windows rolled tight and long sleeves on even though it was pushing 90 degrees. The air conditioning in my beat-up Honda barely worked, but I couldn't stand the thought of some trucker or gas station attendant getting a good look at my scars. The cabin itself was small but clean, just a bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, and living room with knotty pine walls and furniture that looked like it came from the 1970s. There was no TV, no internet, just a landline phone that I unplugged the second day I was there. For the first week, I basically hibernated. I'd brought boxes of books about burn recovery and trauma counseling because I had this idea that maybe I could turn my experience into something useful, help other people who'd been through what I had. During the day, I'd sit on the little back porch and slowly peel away the bandages I'd been hiding under, examining my scars in private for the first time since the accident. It was weird, not having to cover up, not worrying about someone walking in or seeing me through a window. I started writing in a journal about all the feelings I'd been stuffing down, the anger and sadness, and this deep shame that felt like it was eating me alive from the inside. Looking back now, that first week was probably the most normal I'd felt since the fire. I was actually starting to think maybe I could get through this. Maybe I could learn to accept what I looked like and move on with my life. But then things started getting strange. It was the beginning of my second week there when I first noticed the scarves. I was making coffee in the kitchen when I glanced out the window and saw something colorful fluttering from one of the pine trees near the cabin. At first I thought it was just trash that had blown in from somewhere, but when I went outside to look, I found this beautiful silk scarf tied to a low branch. The fabric was gorgeous, smooth and perfect, almost like skin, but in this warm caramel color that seemed to glow in the morning light. I touched it, and honestly, it felt warm. Not just from the sun, but warm like it was alive somehow. The texture was incredible, smoother than anything I'd ever felt, and when I ran my fingers over it, I got this weird sensation like it was responding to my touch. I figured some hiker had lost it, or maybe the wind had carried it from one of the other cabins, so I left it alone. But the next morning, there were 3 more scarves. Different colors this time. One was pale like milk, another was dark like rich chocolate, and the third had this golden tone that reminded me of my skin before the fire. They were all tied to different trees around the cabin, all at about eye level, all swaying gently even though there wasn't any wind I could feel. By the end of the week, there were probably 20 scarves hanging from the trees. Every morning I'd find new ones, all different skin tones and textures, all perfectly smooth and beautiful. The weird part was how quiet the forest had gotten. Usually in the mountains you hear birds, insects, squirrels running around, but around my cabin it was dead silent except for this soft rustling sound like fabric moving, even when the air was completely still. That's when I started noticing changes in the bathroom mirror. At first I thought it was just the lighting, or maybe I was finally starting to heal emotionally, but my reflection looked different, smoother. The scars on my face weren't as pronounced, and my skin had this healthy glow I hadn't seen since before the accident. When I looked closer, though, it wasn't really my face at all. It was like seeing different versions of myself, different ages, different ethnicities, all beautiful and perfect and unmarked. I tried to convince myself it was just wishful thinking, my brain playing tricks because I wanted so badly to look normal again. But then I found the jewelry boxes. They appeared overnight on the bathroom counter. 3 ornate wooden boxes that definitely hadn't been there when I brushed my teeth before bed. Inside was makeup, but not like any makeup I'd ever seen. The foundation changed color as I watched, shifting from pale to dark to match whatever skin tone I was thinking about. When I tried some on, it didn't just cover my scars. It made them disappear completely. The makeup seemed to apply itself, smoothing over my damaged skin until I looked like a completely different person. The masks showed up next. I woke up one morning to find them hanging on the living room walls. Dozens of faces, all perfectly crafted, all beautiful in different ways. I looked like they were made from some kind of flexible material that felt warm and alive when I touched them. One looked like my face before the fire, but older and more confident. Another was completely different. Darker skin, different bone structure, but somehow still me. I know this sounds crazy, but I tried one on. It fit perfectly, like it had been made specifically for my face. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see Maya Johnson, the burn victim. I saw this confident, beautiful woman who could walk into any room without people staring in horror. For the first time in months, I felt attractive. I felt normal. That's when the voices started. They came from the mirrors, soft whispers in different accents and languages I didn't recognize. They complimented the mask I was wearing, told me how gorgeous I looked, suggested which clothes would look best with my new face. My regular clothes had somehow been replaced with beautiful dresses that fit perfectly and made me feel elegant and sophisticated. The voices called my name in admiring tones. "Maya, you look absolutely stunning today." And I found myself spending hours trying on different combinations of masks and outfits. Different personalities started emerging with each mask. With the confident one, I stood straighter and felt powerful. With another, I felt mysterious and alluring. It was like each face came with its own identity, its own way of moving through the world. The voices encouraged me, gave me beauty tips, told me secrets about how to enhance my appearance even more. But it was around midnight on my 3rd week there when I saw them clearly for the first time. I was standing at the bathroom mirror wearing one of the masks when I caught movement in the reflection behind me. Tall figures in elegant clothing were moving through the trees like models on a runway. Their skin was flawless and seemed to shift colors and textures as I watched. Pale to dark, to golden to colors I didn't have names for. They moved with perfect grace, displaying different looks and identities like they were showing off merchandise. More appeared each night. They never spoke directly to me, but they communicated through transformation, showing me possibilities by changing their own appearances. Their voices came from people who would find each look attractive, men and women of all ages telling me how beautiful I could be, how no one would ever stare at me in horror again if I just accepted their help. I realized they were ancient, these things. They'd been helping people escape unwanted appearances for centuries, trading in human identity like other creatures might trade in gold or food. The cabin had been a showroom of sorts, a place where people like me came when they couldn't stand their own faces anymore. The masks were slowly fusing with my skin. Each morning it got harder to remove them, and the makeup seemed to sink deeper into my pores. When I looked in the mirror without any mask on, my reflection sometimes showed the faces I'd been wearing, like they were becoming part of me permanently. One night they showed me their collection. In the forest clearing behind the cabin, dozens of glass cases held what looked like faces. Original identities they'd collected from previous customers. Some looked recent, others seemed old and faded. All of them had the same expression, a kind of empty sadness, like they were mourning their lost selves. The figures offered me permanent transformation. No more Maya Johnson with her burn scars and trauma. I could become anyone I wanted, as beautiful as I wanted, with perfect skin and features that would never attract stares or pity. All I had to do was give up who I really was. But then I saw the others, the people who'd accepted their offer. They stood in the clearing like living dolls, all beautiful and perfect and completely empty. Their eyes held no recognition, no personality, no connection to whoever they used to be. They'd traded their authentic selves for artificial perfection and lost everything that made them human. I understood then what these things really were. Skin merchants. They collected human identity and sold artificial beauty in return. The scars on my face weren't just marks from a fire. They were proof that I'd survived something terrible. They were part of my story, part of who Maya Johnson really was. I ripped off the mask I was wearing and wiped away all the makeup with a wet towel. My real face stared back at me from the mirror, scarred and imperfect, but authentic. The voices in the mirrors turned angry, then pleading, but I packed my things as fast as I could. When I drove away that morning, I saw them in my rearview mirror, sadly packing up their scarves and masks like disappointed salespeople. They'd lost a customer, and honestly, I think that was probably rare for them. I went back to the city that same day and started looking for work as a burn recovery counselor. It took a while to find a place that would hire me, but when I did, I discovered something amazing. Other burn survivors didn't stare at my scars in horror. They saw them as proof that I understood what they were going through. I never wear makeup anymore. I don't cover my scars or hide from people who stare. These marks on my face and arms are proof that I survived, that I chose to remain Maya Johnson instead of becoming some perfect, empty shell. I run a support group now for burn victims, and I tell them the same thing I learned that summer. Your scars are part of your story, not something to be ashamed of. Sometimes packages still show up at my apartment. Expensive skincare products, makeup that promises to cover any imperfection, silk scarves in colors that match my skin tone exactly. I throw them away without opening them, but honestly, I think those things are still hoping I'll change my mind. And I never went back to Trader's Gap, and I never will. But to this day, whenever I see someone trying to hide their scars or their differences, I remember those empty, perfect faces in the forest clearing, and I'm grateful I chose to stay myself. I was 26 when my therapist told me I needed to get away from everything that reminded me of Emma. My wife had died from cancer 8 months earlier, and honestly, I wasn't handling it well. I couldn't sleep in our bed, couldn't eat at our kitchen table, couldn't even walk past the coffee shop where we had our first date without completely falling apart. Dr. Martinez said I needed distance from all those shared memories, at least for a while, so I could start processing the grief without being constantly triggered. That's how I ended up renting a cabin in yesterday's Hollow, Kentucky. I'd never heard of the place before I found it online, but it looked perfect, isolated, no cell service, and most importantly, no memories of Emma anywhere. I loaded up her Honda with boxes of her things I'd been putting off dealing with and drove the 5 hours from Louisville. The car still smelled like her perfume, this vanilla and lavender scent that used to make me feel safe. Now it just made my chest tight. The cabin was exactly what I needed. Small, clean, neutral. No personality, no history I could see. Just a basic kitchen, a bedroom, and a living room with a stone fireplace. I spent the first week trying to sort through Emma's belongings, her letters, photo albums, jewelry, clothes that still smelled like her. I'd read her old cards to me, Look at pictures from our wedding, try to process 2 years of watching cancer slowly take her away from me. Most nights I fell asleep holding her pillow, dreaming about better times when she was healthy and we thought we had forever. I was planning to eventually donate most of her things, but I wasn't ready yet. To be fair, I don't think I would have ever been ready. The weird stuff started in the second week. I was walking around the property just trying to clear my head when I found these old wooden boxes buried in shallow holes around the cabin. Not buried deep, like someone had just covered them with a thin layer of dirt and leaves. Inside each box were love letters, but not Emma's. These were from different couples, different time periods. Some looked like they were from the 1940s, others from the 80s, even some that seemed more recent. The letters were beautiful, honestly. They talked about marriages, engagements, anniversaries, stories of couples meeting, falling in love, building lives together. I probably shouldn't have read them, but they were comforting in a strange way, like proof that other people had found real love too. That night, I started hearing whispered conversations coming from the forest, soft voices, like couples talking quietly to each other. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was gentle, loving. I figured it might be other campers or hikers, even though the rental company said the nearest neighbor was miles away. The next morning, something was off with my photo albums. I'd left them organized on the kitchen table, our wedding photos in one stack, vacation pictures in another. But now they were all mixed up, and there were pictures I didn't recognize scattered between Emma's photos. Pictures of other couples, other weddings, other happy moments. They looked old, like they belonged with those letters I'd found. My laptop was acting strange too. When I opened the folder with our digital photos, Emma's pictures were mixed in with images I'd never seen before. Other people's wedding days, anniversary dinners, romantic getaways. But the weird thing was, they didn't look out of place. It was like they belonged there, like my memories were blending with someone else's. I found more things over the next few days. Beautiful snow globes hidden around the cabin that showed perfect scenes when you shook them. Couples dancing, romantic picnics, sunset walks on beaches. Antique Pock. At watches hanging from tree branches all stopped at different times, but when I held them, I could swear I heard Emma's laugh mixed with other voices I didn't recognize. The temperature around these objects was always warm, even when the air was cold. Like standing near a fire, but more comforting. Like being hugged. Here's the thing that should have scared me, but didn't. My grief was getting better. The crushing weight I'd been carrying for months was lifting. The painful memories of Emma's illness, of watching her fade away, of those last horrible weeks in the hospital, they were becoming fuzzy. Instead, I was remembering only the good times, and those memories felt stronger, brighter, more real than they ever had. But they also felt different. When I remembered our wedding day, Emma's voice sounded layered, like multiple women were speaking at once. When I pictured our first apartment, it looked bigger, more perfect than it actually was. The memories were better than the real thing had been. I started seeing figures in the trees at night, tall shapes in white, moving slowly through the forest like they were dancing, always in pairs, always graceful, always happy. They reminded me of wedding parties, but they never seemed to end, just endless dancing, endless celebration. The voice that called my name sounded like Emma, but not exactly. It was her voice mixed with others, creating something that felt like the perfect wife, kind, loving, never sick, never scared, never in pain. When I heard it, I felt completely loved in a way that seemed too good to be true, because it was too good to be true. By the third week, I realized what was happening. Emma's things were changing too. Her letters to me were different, with words I knew she'd never written. Her photos showed her smiling in ways I didn't remember, in places we'd never been. Even her perfume smell was stronger, sweeter, more perfect than it had ever been in real life. I wasn't grieving anymore, but I was losing Emma, the real Emma, who'd been brave and scared and human, who'd cried when she lost her hair from chemo, who'd gotten angry at the unfairness of it all, who'd held my hand and told me she was afraid to die. The things, the letters, the snow globes, the watches, the voices, they were editing my memories, keeping only the perfect parts, erasing everything that hurt. But that hurt was part of loving Emma. The fear, the loss, the way she fought until the very end. That was real. That mattered. One night I followed the dancing figures deeper into the forest. They led me to a clearing where I could see dozens of people standing perfectly still, all smiling the same empty smile. They looked content, peaceful, but there was nothing behind their eyes. Like they were dreaming and couldn't wake up. I understood then. These things, whatever they were, collected love stories. They preserved the good parts and threw away the rest. They offered people a choice: keep the pain and grief and complicated reality of love, or trade it for a perfect fantasy that never ended. Most people, when they were hurting badly enough, chose the fantasy. But standing there in that clearing, I realized that choosing the fantasy meant betraying everything Emma had gone through. Her courage, her fight, her real human love that included fear and imperfection and loss. If I let them edit out the hard parts, I'd be saying her struggle didn't matter. I ran back to the cabin and destroyed every single object I'd found, smashed the snow globes, threw the watches into the fireplace, burned the letters. It hurt. God, it hurt so much to feel the full weight of losing her again. But it was honest hurt. Real hurt. The kind Emma would have wanted me to feel because it meant I understood what we'd actually shared. I packed everything that night and drove home. The grief hit me like a truck again, but this time I was ready for it. I started going to a support group for young widowers, Eventuous. I became a grief counselor myself, helping other people who'd lost spouses learn to carry their pain without being crushed by it. I got married again 5 years later to a woman named Sarah, who knew all about Emma and never tried to replace her or make me forget. We have 2 kids now, and sometimes I tell them about their honorary Aunt Emma, the woman who taught their dad what real love looks like. I still get packages sometimes. Old love letters addressed to me, postmarked from places I've never been. I throw them away without opening them. I know what they're offering, and I'm not interested, because real love includes the ending, and Emma deserved to be remembered for all of it. I was 25 when I lost my hearing in a car accident, and honestly, I thought my life was over. I'd been a music producer since I was 17, working with local bands around Nashville, and suddenly I couldn't hear a single note. The doctors kept telling me it wasn't coming back, that I needed to accept it and find a new path. But music wasn't just my job. It was everything I was. About 6 months after the accident, I was sitting in my apartment surrounded by all this equipment I couldn't use anymore, feeling completely disconnected from the world. My savings were running low, and I had to make a decision. Either figure out how to keep going or give up on music entirely. That's when I remembered this cabin my uncle owned up in Echo Canyon, Virginia. He'd always said I could use it whenever I needed to think. So I packed up my car with the visual alert systems I'd had installed and drove up there to basically decide whether to quit music forever. The drive took about 4 hours, and I'll be honest, it was weird driving without being able to hear the engine or the radio. Everything felt muffled and distant, like I was watching life happen behind glass. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was struck by how it sat right in this natural bowl between these massive rock walls. My uncle had mentioned it was called Echo Canyon because sound bounced around between the rocks, which felt like some kind of cruel joke at the time. The first week I just sat there in complete silence. Well, silence for me anyway. I could see birds flying around, trees moving in the wind, but it was like watching a movie with the sound turned off. I'd brought some of my equipment, thinking maybe I could try using vibrations to feel music through the floor or walls, but it was pretty limited. I spent most of my time just staring out the window, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with my life now. I was seriously considering learning sign language, maybe teaching deaf kids about rhythm and beat. At least that way I could stay connected to music somehow. But honestly, I felt like I was mourning the death of everything that had ever mattered to me. Music had been my identity since I was a kid, and now I couldn't even tell if someone was talking to me unless I was looking right at them. It was during the second week that things started getting strange. I began feeling vibrations that didn't match anything I could see, like I'd be sitting at the kitchen table and the floor would start pulsing with these complex rhythms, but there was nothing that should have been causing it. No machinery running, no construction nearby, nothing. At first I thought maybe it was my imagination, or maybe my brain was trying to compensate for the hearing loss somehow. But the vibrations kept getting stronger and more intricate. They'd create these patterns I could feel through my skin and bones, like there was some invisible orchestra playing right underneath the cabin. And here's the weird part. When I looked outside, the forest seemed to be moving in time with what I was feeling. The leaves would dance and sway in perfect rhythm, even when there wasn't any wind. I decided to hook up some of my music equipment to see if it would pick up anything. The computer software I used could translate sound waves into visual patterns on the screen, and when I turned it on, it went absolutely crazy. Colors and shapes were flowing across the monitor in these beautiful, complex patterns that matched exactly what I was feeling through the vibrations. It was like the equipment was translating something for me, showing me music in a way I'd never experienced before. That's when I started noticing the crystal formations in the canyon walls. They were huge, shaped like tuning forks, and they seemed to be vibrating constantly. I could feel the resonance in my chest and stomach when I got close to them. And hanging from the trees all around the cabin were these wooden instruments, drums, flutes, harps, all playing themselves somehow. There wasn't any wind strong enough to move them, but they kept creating vibrations that traveled through the ground and up into my body. The temperature changes started creating different vibration patterns too. When it got cold, the feelings were sharp and precise. When it warmed up, everything felt smooth and flowing. My body was becoming incredibly sensitive to these vibrations, like my skin was turning into some kind of musical instrument that could pick up information I'd never known existed. Then the cabin itself started changing. The walls began conducting vibrations more efficiently, like they were turning into resonant chambers. Everything, the furniture, the dishes, even my clothes, started pulsing with rhythm. It was like the whole place was becoming one giant musical instrument, and I was sitting right in the middle of it. Around the third week, I started feeling my name being called through the floor vibrations. Not hearing it, but feeling it spelled out in rhythmic patterns that somehow made sense to me. Multiple rhythm patterns would layer together, creating what I can only describe as messages in some kind of vibration language. And through these patterns, I began to sense the voices of other musicians who had visited the canyon before me. The vibrations told stories of composers, singers, and players who had found new ways to experience music. People who had lost their hearing, or maybe never had it, but had discovered something here that let them connect with music in ways hearing people couldn't understand. That's when I started seeing them. These tall figures made of what looked like condensed sound waves, visible distortions in the air. They moved like they were conducting invisible orchestras, their arms creating patterns that generated the vibration symphonies I'd been feeling. The sound weavers, I started calling them in my head. They were shaping acoustic energy into physical form, making music something you could touch and feel instead of just hear. More appeared each night, all working to translate hearing into other senses. They communicated through vibration patterns that completely bypassed the ears. Sometimes they'd mimic voices through the floor and wall vibrations, but instead of words, I'd feel familiar rhythms that somehow conveyed meaning. I realized these were ancient beings who had been preserving music across all forms of perception. They'd been helping deaf musicians for centuries, offering alternate ways to experience sound that most people never even knew existed. Previous visitors to the cabin had learned to hear through vibration, becoming vibration musicians who created art that only people like me could truly appreciate. My sensitivity to rhythm and beat was becoming superhuman. The entities were showing me vibration music that hearing people couldn't access or understand. They offered me mastery of tactile music, the ability to feel entire symphonies through touch alone. And I understood this wasn't about curing my deafness. It was about discovering a completely different way to experience music, one that might actually be richer than what I'd lost. I saw other deaf musicians in the canyon, all creating these beautiful vibration compositions. They'd developed an entirely new art form that the hearing world couldn't access or comprehend. These people hadn't lost their connection to music. They'd found a deeper one. I had a choice to make. I could learn this vibration music while keeping my connection to the hearing world, or I could retreat back to my apartment and give up on music entirely. The sound weavers weren't trying to replace my hearing. They were showing me that there were other ways to be a musician. Other ways to create and experience art. I chose to learn. I spent the rest of my time at the cabin developing my sensitivity to vibrations, learning to interpret the complex patterns the sound weavers were teaching me. They showed me how to use this ability to bridge the deaf and hearing communities, how to create music that could be experienced through touch and vibration. When I finally drove away from Echo Canyon, I had plans to create vibration-based music therapy for deaf children. I returned to Nashville and developed what became a revolutionary music program for deaf students. I became a pioneer in tactile music education, helping others discover this alternate musical perception that I'd stumbled upon. I never tried to restore my hearing artificially. What I'd learned in that canyon was that vibration was a legitimate musical sense, not some poor substitute for hearing. I built a whole new career creating music for the deaf community while educating hearing people about what they were missing. Looking back now, 3 years later, I sometimes feel the canyon's vibrations in the city concrete when I'm walking downtown. I know the sound weavers appreciate the choice I made. I've helped dozens of deaf kids discover their own musical abilities through vibration and touch. And honestly, I think I understand music better now than I ever did when I could hear. I still don't talk about the sound weavers much. People think I'm just being poetic when I describe music as something you can feel through your whole body. But I know there's a whole world of musical experience that most people never access, a deeper way of connecting with rhythm and melody that exists beyond the ears. To this day, I've never gone back to Echo Canyon. I don't need to. The sound weavers gave me everything I needed to rebuild my life, and I carry their lessons with me everywhere I go. I was 25 when the plant closed down and took my job with it. Honestly, I thought I had everything figured out back then. I'd been working the same factory job for 3 years, had a decent apartment, even started saving up for a truck. Then one Tuesday morning, they called us all into the break room and told us the company was moving operations to Mexico. Just like that, I was unemployed with maybe 2 months of savings to my name. That's when my mom called about my great-uncle's place. Uncle Pete had died the month before, and apparently he'd left his old cabin to me. I barely remembered the guy, maybe saw him twice at family reunions when I was little. But Mom said the cabin was up on Thornbush Ridge in eastern Kentucky, and if I fixed it up right, I could probably sell it for around $30,000. That was more money than I'd ever had at one time, and honestly, it sounded like the answer to all my problems. I loaded up my pickup with every tool I owned, threw in some clothes and camping gear, and headed up the mountain. The drive took most of a day, winding through these narrow roads that got smaller and smaller until I wasn't sure my truck would make it. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt track, maybe 2 miles from the nearest neighbor. It was rough looking, but the bones were good. Needed a new roof, some paint, and the porch was sagging pretty bad, but nothing I couldn't handle. I figured 3 weeks would be enough time to get it ready for a realtor. I had it all planned out. Patch the holes, replace the broken windows, fix the porch, slap some paint on everything. Basic stuff that would make it look decent enough to sell. I was already mentally spending that $30,000. The first week went exactly like I'd hoped. The weather was perfect. Cool mountain air and clear skies. I patched holes in the walls, replaced 3 windows that were completely busted out, and started tearing off the old shingles. The work felt good after months of just standing at a machine pushing buttons. I was actually building something, fixing something with my own hands. I slept like a rock every night, and for the first time since losing my job, I felt like maybe things were going to work out. By the end of that first week, the place was already looking 100 times better. I'd gotten the roof patched, most of the windows replaced, and I'd even started thinking maybe I should keep the cabin instead of selling it. There was something peaceful about being up there, away from everything. No traffic, no neighbors playing loud music, just the sound of wind in the trees and birds singing. But during the second week, things started getting weird. I woke up Monday morning and there were these thick roots growing up through the floorboards. I'm talking massive things, as thick as my arm, just pushing right up between the planks like they'd grown overnight. I went outside to check the foundation, thinking maybe there was some kind of damage I'd missed, but everything looked solid. The roots were only inside the cabin, nowhere else. When I looked closer, the roots were actually moving. Not fast, but if I sat still and watched, I could see them swaying back and forth like they were underwater or something. And the whole forest had gotten noisy, not with birds or animals, but with this constant creaking sound, like old wooden ships rocking in a harbor. The trees were groaning and shifting all the time now, even when there wasn't any wind. That's when my tools started acting up. Well, not acting up exactly, but the materials I was working with kept changing. I'd grab a piece of lumber and it would have bark growing on it, or I'd open my paint can and find leaves floating in it. My paintbrushes started sprouting actual leaves while I as using them. The nails I'd brought turned into thorns, and the roll of hardware cloth I'd planned to use for repairs had somehow become a massive spider web. But the weirdest part was what I found under the cabin. The root system down there had grown into words. Not carved, grown. Like someone had trained the roots to spell things out in cursive writing. The first message I found said, "Welcome," in letters about 2 feet tall. The next day it said, "Stay," then "Grow," then "Join." I tried to tell myself it was just coincidence, that roots grow in all kinds of patterns, but these were too perfect, too deliberate. And they changed every day, spelling out new messages like someone was writing me letters. My truck started having problems too. The tires looked fine, but when I got underneath to check, I found root systems growing right into the rubber, not damaging it, but creating some kind of connection, like the truck was putting down roots of its own. The engine would still start, but it felt different, like it was breathing instead of running. The temperature under the cabin never changed. I checked it with a thermometer I'd brought. 55 degrees day and night, no matter what the weather was doing outside. Perfect growing conditions for whatever was happening down there. My work clothes started changing too. Little shoots and leaves would sprout from the fabric while I was wearing them. I'd look down and see tiny branches growing out of my shirt sleeves or small flowers blooming on my jeans. It didn't hurt, but it was like the clothes were becoming part of something living. The cabin itself was growing. I know how that sounds, but I watched it happen. The walls would extend themselves overnight, adding new rooms that branched off the main structure. The windows stopped being glass and became this clear bark material that you could see through perfectly. The doors grew directly from tree trunks, complete with hinges made of twisted wood. I started hearing voices through the floor. Not clear words, but conversations happening somewhere in the root network. Under the cabin. They talked about seasons and rainfall, about which animals were moving where, about managing the forest like it was some kind of business. Professional discussions between coworkers, except the coworkers were roots. One morning I woke up and found my name spelled out in root growth on the inside wall of the cabin. Marcus in letters that got bigger every day, with new shoots and branches adding to each letter like they were still being written. That's when I started seeing the figures in the forest. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, and they looked like they were made of woven roots and branches. They moved between the trees with this rustling sound, like wind blowing through leaves, but there wasn't any wind. They worked constantly, pruning and shaping, tending the forest like gardeners. There seemed to be more of them every night, each one taking care of a different section of the mountain. They communicated by releasing these scents that would change my mood. Sweet smells that made me feel calm and happy. Bitter ones that made me anxious. Earthy ones that made me feel sleepy. It was like they were dosing me with chemicals to see how I'd react. Sometimes I'd hear my own voice coming from hollow tree trunks around the cabin. Not echoes, but perfect copies of things I'd said earlier, played back through the wood. They were learning to mimic human speech, but getting it from the trees instead of from mouths. I realized these things had been there for a long time. Centuries, maybe. They were part of the forest, or maybe they were the forest, keeping everything balanced and healthy. But something was wrong. They moved differently now, slower and more carefully, like they were sick or dying. I started to understand they were desperate. The cabin showed me things. I'd touch the walls and see visions of what this place used to be like. Other people had lived here before, people who'd made some kind of deal with the root walkers. They became part of the forest system, living forever as guardians, taking care of the mountain in exchange for immortality. Every repair I made to the cabin got absorbed into this living building. My work wasn't fixing anything, it was feeding something. The cabin wanted to become a permanent part of the forest, growing and changing forever instead of staying a normal house. The root walkers showed me what they were offering. I could see it clearly, a future where humans and the forest worked together, where I'd live forever as a guardian of Thornbush Ridge, tending the mountain and keeping it healthy. All I had to do was accept the connection that was already starting, because it had started. My skin was developing bark patterns, and my fingers were sprouting small twigs. I could feel my life force being integrated into the forest system. The change was subtle but constant, and I understood that once it finished, I'd never be able to leave. I tried cutting the roots, but they regrew instantly. The cabin healed itself around any damage I did. The root walkers didn't fight me or try to stop me. They just looked sad and kept working, like they'd accepted that I might refuse their offer. When I tried to start my truck, the battery was completely dead. All the electrical systems had been drained by the roots that had grown into them. My phone was dead too, and my flashlight, and even my digital watch had stopped working. I packed what I could carry and hiked out on foot. The roots didn't follow me past the tree line, and once I got to the main road, everything started working normally again. My watch started ticking. My phone got signal like I'd walked out of some kind of dead zone. I hitchhiked to the nearest town and called my mom. She told me I'd been gone for 6 months. 6 months. To me, it felt like 3 weeks, exactly like I'd planned. I sold the cabin to a logging company sight unseen. I needed money more than I needed to worry about environmental concerns, and honestly, I just wanted the whole thing to be someone else's problem. I moved to Arizona after that. Desert climate, as far from forests as I could get. I developed this severe allergy to wood and plants. Even being around trees makes me break out in hives. I work construction now, only concrete and steel projects. I won't even touch lumber. But sometimes I get packages in the mail with no return address. Fresh fruit that tastes like mountain soil, or flowers that smell like the cabin used to smell. I throw them away immediately, but I know what they mean. The forest remembers me. And somewhere up on Thornbush Ridge, those root walkers are still tending their mountain, still looking for someone willing to stay. I was 22 when my therapist told me I needed to get away from everything and everyone for a while. I was studying art therapy at Virginia Commonwealth University, but honestly, I wasn't doing too good after my twin sister Amy died in a car crash 6 months before. We were identical twins, did everything together our whole lives, and when she was gone, I felt like half of me was just missing. My therapist, Dr. Martinez, said I had survivor's guilt real bad and suggested I take some time at this cabin she knew about up at Mirror Lake in the mountains. Said it might help me process things better than sitting in her office twice a week talking about feelings. The drive up there took about 3 hours from Richmond. I was driving Amy's car, a beat-up Honda Civic she'd painted these little flowers all over the doors. I kept it after the accident because being inside it felt like getting a hug from her somehow. The cabin was this little wooden place that overlooked the lake, and I gotta say it was exactly what I needed. The lake was perfectly still, like glass, reflecting the sky so clear you couldn't tell where the water ended and the air began. It was peaceful in a way that made my chest feel less tight for the first time in months. The first week went really well, to be honest. I set up Amy's old art supplies on the porch and painted watercolors of the lake every morning. She'd always been the better artist between us, but we used to paint together when we were kids, making these collaborative pieces where you couldn't tell who did what part. Being there with her brushes and her paints, it felt like she was right there with me, you know? I even slept in some of her clothes I'd brought, this old paint-stained sweater she wore to every art class. It sounds weird, but it helped. I was having these dreams where we were painting together again, just like when we were little. In the dreams, we'd sit by the lake and work on the same canvas, our hands moving at the same time, creating these amazing pictures neither of us could have made alone. I'd wake up feeling better than I had since the accident, like maybe I was finally starting to heal or whatever. But during the second week, things started getting strange. I was out on the dock one morning, painting the sunrise, when I looked down at my reflection in the water. Instead of just me sitting there, I saw two people. Amy was right beside me in the reflection, waving and smiling like she was actually there. I jerked back and looked around, but there was nobody else on the dock. When I looked back at the water, it was just my reflection again. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Grief does weird things to your brain, Dr. Martinez had told me that. But it kept happening. Every time I looked at the lake, Amy would appear next to me in the reflection. Sometimes she'd point at things or gesture like she was trying to tell me something. The weird part was her reflection would move completely separate from mine. I'd be sitting still, and she'd be waving her arms around. Then I started noticing other things. When I was painting, it felt like someone else was guiding the brush. I'd make one stroke, but somehow there'd be two layers on the canvas, like someone was painting the exact same thing right on top of what I was doing. The pictures started looking more like Amy's style than mine. And when I took photos with my phone to send to my parents, every single picture showed both of us. Not like a double exposure or anything. Amy looked solid and real, standing right next to me. Around the cabin, I started finding these little glass fragments arranged in patterns. They were all different sizes and shapes. Some looked like pieces of broken mirrors. Others were just smooth stones that had been polished until they reflected light. They'd be arranged in circles around the porch or lined up on the windowsills. When I looked into them, they showed things that weren't there. Rooms I'd never seen before, people I didn't recognize, places that looked familiar but wrong somehow. The temperature would drop whenever I got near these glass pieces, like drop enough that I could see my breath even though it was summer. And the glass would fog up, but instead of just condensation, there'd be these shapes in the fog. Handprints mostly, small ones that looked exactly like Amy's hands. My shadow started acting up too. Instead of one shadow following me around, there were two. One did what I did, but the other one moved on its own. I'd be standing still, and the second shadow would wave at me or draw hearts in the sand with its finger. Sometimes I'd see it reach out like it was trying to hold my hand. The lake itself was the worst part, though. I'd hear Amy's voice calling to me from across the water, but the sound would bounce weird, like it was coming from 6 different directions at once. Each voice sounded slightly different, but they were all definitely her voice. And when I looked at the lake surface, I could see conversations happening between reflections, like silent movies playing out in the water, showing me and Amy talking and laughing together. One evening, just after sunset, I saw Amy walking on the lake. Not swimming, walking. Her feet were leaving ripples on the surface, but she wasn't sinking through. She was wearing the same clothes she'd died in. This blue sundress with tiny white flowers that I'd helped her pick out for a date she never made it to. She looked solid and real, not see-through or ghostly like you'd expect. She was smiling at me and gesturing for me to come closer. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in this. Looking more carefully at the lake, I could see other people under the surface, dozens of them, all just standing there in the water, looking up at me. They looked like they were missing something, incomplete, somehow. Their faces were familiar in that way, where you can't place someone, but you know you've seen them before. And there were more reflections appearing in the lake surface. Not just Amy, but other people too. They all seemed to be reaching toward their person on the shore, trying to communicate, trying to connect. Some looked desperate, others looked angry. But they all looked trapped. Amy's reflection started getting more intense. Instead of just waving, she'd show me memories in the water. Our 8th birthday party, graduation day, the last conversation we had before she died. But the memories felt wrong, like they were being twisted somehow. She'd show me the fight we had the day before the accident, but in her version, I was the one being cruel. She'd show me times I'd been jealous of her, times I'd wished I was the better twin. I started understanding what was happening. These things, whatever they were, they fed on connections between people. They collected lost relationships, preserved them like specimens. But they trapped the living person in cycles of grief and guilt. The people under the lake had chosen to stay, to join their reflections rather than learn to live without them. Amy's reflection was getting more desperate every day. She'd mouth words at me through the water, begging me to jump in, to join her so we could be together forever. The lake would show me this perfect life where we were eternal twins, never separated, never having to face loss or grief or growing up without each other. But looking back now, I think I knew it wasn't really Amy. The real Amy would never try to manipulate me like that, never use my guilt against me. The real Amy would want me to heal, to live, to become the person I was supposed to be, even without her. The breaking point came when I realized there were dozens of these trapped people under the lake surface, and they were all missing their reflections. That's what the things were. Reflection thieves. They stole your reflection, wore it like a mask, and used it to lure you into staying forever. I spent an entire day breaking every piece of glass around the cabin. Mirrors, windows, bottles, those polished stones, everything that could show a reflection. The screaming that came from the lake when I did it was horrible. It sounded like Amy, but also like 100 other voices all crying out at once. The lake's surface started churning, waves crashing against the shore even though there was no wind. But I didn't look at the water. I packed my stuff, got in Amy's car, and drove away without checking the rearview mirror once. I was terrified of what I might see following me. I went back to school after that and finished my art therapy degree. I became a grief counselor, specializing in helping people who'd lost twins or siblings. I've helped a lot of people work through survivor's guilt over the years. I keep all the mirrors in my apartment covered, though. I can't risk seeing false reflections again. Sometimes, when I'm really quiet and really listening, I can hear Amy's real voice in my memory. Not the desperate, manipulative voice from the lake, but her actual voice from when she was alive. That's how I know the difference now between love and manipulation, between healthy grief and the kind that traps you forever. I still don't go near lakes or ponds if I can help it. And I never, ever look at my reflection longer than I have to.